So hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's forecasting forum. And I'm going to get started with our first page here. So how many of you are curious about the next part of your soul's journey? Anybody curious? Yes, Margaret is curious. Yes, Nikki, very good. Yes, me too. So, of course, soul's journey, right? Connected to our moon nodes, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Then how many of you have personal planets or points in Gemini or Sagittarius? Gemini or Sagittarius? Liz, of course, yes, lots of Gemini. There we go. Anybody else? Well, I think a lot of you have. I know Aida does. Margaret, very good, very good. And then how many of you have an ascendant or sun sign in Taurus or Libra? Taurus or Libra? Liz? Yep. Me too. Both Taurus and Libra. Okay. All right. So if you're watching this as a recording, by the way, please feel free to participate as well as I'm asking questions, because sometimes that's a great way to stay engaged. All right, so first of all, thanks so much for being here. For so many of you, I'm delighted, and thanks for taking the time. And as most of you know, I'm originally from Austria, from Vienna, and I've lived in the United States since a long time, 25 years now. So English is not my first language, but I'm pretty versed with it. I'm okay with it, I think. But if I say things in a funny way, that's because it's not my first language. So forgive that. And as far as my astrology background goes, of course, most of you know that I've been doing this for a long, long time. I started diving into astrology when I was in my teenage years. And then I just kept studying and studying and studying until I got a certification in 2005. And yeah, ever since then, I've just been like engaging more and more and more with it pretty much. So it's just something I love, that I'm passionate about. And I think it's such a wonderful tool to support us and help us with, aligning ourselves with the energies out there and how we can connect to, what's happening in the universe and what's happening in our inner universe. And I think it's a wonderful way to get to know ourselves and to understand, what's occurring in the now moment, right? So today, of course, we're going to talk about the moon nodes in Gemini-Sagittarius, and that will start on May 5th and will go all the way to January 2022. So that's 20 months of the moon nodes being in Gemini-Sagittarius, and we'll go into what that means exactly in a moment. The other thing we'll also be talking about is the Venus station and retrograde phase. We have the first station phase will be April 30th until May 24th. And the station phases are always, they happen before the retrograde phase starts, but they last usually also after the retrograde phase has already started. So it's kind of like, it's the time when the planet slows down and moves slower than normal. So as it gets back to its regular speed, the station phase ends. So that's why you have the station phase right before the planet comes to a halt and switches directions, and then also a little bit after that happens, because it's still moving slowly even once it's already retrograde. And then, of course, there's a second station phase at the end of the retrograde phase as well, as it's starting to slow down again, coming to a halt to go direct, and then to speed up again to its normal pace. And so we have a station phase at the beginning, at the end, and the retrograde phase in the middle. And then, of course, we also have the shadow phases with any retrograde phase as well, which we usually only take a look at the shadow phases with faster moving planets, because the slower moving planets go retrograde every 6 months. So there's a shadow phase all the time. So we don't really take a look at that. But with Venus, the shadow phase is already started on April 9th and will go until the moment she goes retrograde on May 13th. And then the second shadow phase after the retrograde phase will be June 25, which is when the planet goes direct, until July 28, 29, like right around midnight. And that will be when then Venus moves out of her shadow phase. And the shadow phases, as I mentioned in our last forecasting forum already, it has to do with the planet moving through the same territory that it's moved through during the retrograde phase. It moves through that same territory before the retrograde phase and after the retrograde phase as well. So basically Venus will move 3 times through the same zone. And that's why it's important to pay attention to these shadow phases as well, because there's something in that particular area, in that particular path that Venus is taking 3 times, that is of interest to us, especially if we have personal planets in those degrees or a point. So the degrees that we're talking about here are connected to 5 degrees of Gemini until almost 22 degrees of Gemini, right? So basically, if you have anything between 5 degrees and 22 of Gemini, then Venus will move over that particular point or planet 3 times, right? So and that's important because there's a process at play there. But actually, before I go too much into the Venus retrograde, I'm already starting to get into the zone. I actually want to say that if you have a question, I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the webinar. And if there's something that can't wait until the end because you can't move forward otherwise, then let me know about that. But I like to take questions at the end just so we can talk about, we can really engage with the subject, because we have a lot to cover today with the moon nodes and the Venus retrograde, right? And if I have your chart, I will be able to look that up on your chart. And if I don't have your chart yet, then just give me your, sign, degree, house placements, as much as you can give me, so that I can answer questions as much as possible. All right. And if there's anything that you want to know that might take a little bit too much time from with your answer, then I will ask you to book a reading. And I hope that makes sense, because I want to make sure that everybody gets value from the questions. All right. So, and then of course we want to connect the questions with whatever we're covering right now this month, right? Okay. So let's take a quick look here at the overview for May. So I emailed all of you some attachments, and one of the attachments was this. So feel free to take a look at that with me or at any time. It basically gives you a nice picture of what's happening this month. And so you can see a little bit better like how things are unfolding. For those of you who don't understand, what these entries mean completely, I always write about all of these things in the weekly forecast, or I talk about them in the new moon or full moon videos. So just know that the information in more detail is always available as well, right? And of course, we'll also talk about some of the stuff in the month of forecasting forums. So month of May, I just want to say a brief thing about the month of May, which is that there's so much going on. There is a lot of planets stationing, a lot of planets going retrograde. As you can see here in this turquoise color, Saturn is going retrograde, Venus is going retrograde, Jupiter is going retrograde. So there's a lot of, and then Pluto, of course, is still stationing because it already went retrograde. So I mentioned that already in the full moon video a little bit, right? But the fact that there's so many station phases and retrograde phases happening in such a short amount of time means that there's a shift that we're experiencing internally and externally, right? There's something happening where we're needing to shift into a more introspective connection with ourselves. Whenever a planet goes retrograde, there's something that happens where we need to turn inwards, and we need to learn how to align with that energy from inside and get more clear about where we're at with that particular energy. Does whatever is internally happening resonate with what is externally happening? Right? So we have a lot of that happening this month. So Saturn, of course, has to do with our structures. It has to do with our commitments. It has to do with our ability to be self-responsible. And so we're getting to see where are we at with that, right? And then Venus, of course, we'll talk about that in more detail, but of course has to do with relationships. It has to do with self-worth. It has to do with our values, what we value, how we value ourselves, how we value others, how we align with that. So some of it can also sometimes to do with finances and with money, of course, because that's part of that. So we'll talk about that more today. But the third one is Jupiter. And Jupiter, of course, has to do with our ability to grow and expand and to learn about life through our own life experiences. And we'll talk a little bit also about Jupiter in connection with the moon nodes. So as you can see here, the moon nodes are still in Capricorn Cancer until May 5th. And then on May 5th, the moon node entered Gemini-Sagittarius until January 2022. And so let's start talking about this a little bit, right? Because when the moon nodes they switch signs every 18 to 20 months, right? Depending on the sign that they're in. And what happens is they have every planet and the moon nodes as well, they have cycles, right? Like in astrology, I talk a lot about the cycles, right, of things. And the cycles are important because things will always come back to a particular place at some point. And the moon nodes come back to a particular cycle like this one every 18 years. So it's an 18-year cycle that the south node will be in Sagittarius and the north node will be in Gemini. Now, there's also a 9-year cycle within that where the moon nodes switch sign, where they switch places. So every 9 years, the moon nodes will be in Gemini-Sagittarius. However, every 9 years, there will be a swap between south node and north node. So 9 years from now, the south node will be in Gemini and the north node will be in Sagittarius. Or 9 years ago, the south node was in Gemini and the north node was in Sagittarius. But 18 years ago, the moon nodes were exactly as they're going to be now for the next 20 months. Does that make sense, guys, what I'm sharing here? Don't want to get too, too heady with all of this, but I hope that makes sense. So what we can look at when we hear about the cycles, right? What we can do with the cycles is that we can look back to see what happened 18 years ago. If you remember what happened 18 years ago. So basically October 2001 until April 2003. That would be the time frame that we want to look at to see what happened during that time frame for me when the moon nodes were in those signs, because that means that they were traveling through the same houses as they will be traveling right now. And of course, because the moon nodes represent our soul's journey, there's something about that particular phase where we're being invited to connect to certain things more fully. And to find also a way to balance out the two energies. Whenever the moon nodes are in two signs, both of those signs get an opportunity to be integrated with each other more fully, right? So for the last 18 months, for example, we've had Capricorn Cancer. So we've been learning to integrate the Capricorn Cancer energy with each other, learning to understand how we're feeling about things and how we can be more self-reliant and self-responsible out there in the world. And maybe not everybody learned that lesson, to be fair, right? But there is certainly a collective lesson, as well as there is an individual process with the moon nodes when that happens, that collectively we're learning to engage a little bit more with what is safe or what is safety, right? And what have we learned about out there in the world, our status out there in the world, or our long-term goals, or how we're doing as a society, right? And so how can we integrate the two? How can we connect the two? And of course, that's been a pretty big theme, right, in the last 18 months with Cancer Capricorn. So now that the moon nodes move into Gemini Sagittarius, there is this sense that we're needing to learn to sort of integrate or differentiate between what is information and what is interpretation, right? Because Gemini is very much about learning and gathering information and sharing information, right? And processing information. And so the North Node there invites us to make an effort, right? Wherever the North Node is, that's where we need to make an effort. That's where we need to work harder. And we need to go, okay, this is what we need. This is what we need. This is what I need. And this is what's going to be fulfilling to do, right? So wherever the North Node is, this is what we need to engage with more. I don't want to say more consciously, but we want to engage with it in a more active manner, right? Wherever the South Node is in Sagittarius, Sagittarius has to do with our stories. It has to do with our belief systems. It has to do with our interpretation of life, our life philosophies. And wherever the South Node is, we need to bring a certain amount of consciousness, because sometimes we operate on a autopilot there. And we want to make sure that we're actually engaging with the Sagittarian energy in a healthy way, because wherever the South Node is, there can be some unhealthy behaviors, right? So just like we had it with Capricorn, right? Capricorn was where the South Node was for the last 18 months. And Capricorn, we could see some behaviors that were maybe not as useful to us, where we were overworking ourselves, or we were focusing too much on getting things perfect and right, and like just kind of like focusing too much on the outside world, or the status of the outside world and all that stuff, right? But we had to really make an effort to kind of connect with our feeling body and connect with what helps us connect to ourselves and to others, right? So there we had to make more of an effort. And so anybody who, like, say, has planets in Gemini, right? You are the people right now who need to kind of be the inspiration for the rest of us, because people who don't have planets in Gemini will have a much harder time with tapping into the Gemini energy. But for those of you who do have planets in Gemini, you know how to do this. You know what that feels. So you need to be sort of the beacon of, like, this is how you can do it. This is what it looks like to be, a Gemini, and to as much as possible tap into the healthy parts of Gemini, right? So the wanting to connect, wanting to be engaged, but in a curious way, in an open-minded kind of a way, right? So we're really wanting to be open-minded and curious. These are really two wonderful keywords for the highest vibration of Gemini. And information, it's about information, right? It's about learning, it's about sharing, it's about processing, it's about our own inner dialogue, but also how we connect that inner dialogue with the outside world. And then Sagittarius, of course, there we need to really take a look to see what do we believe in, or what have we been conditioned into, socially speaking, right? Because Sagittarius is sort of like a social sign, and it's connected to Jupiter as well, right? So what have we been conditioned into, that certain belief system, whether that's cultural belief systems, whether that's religious belief systems, whether that's belief systems because of the gender that we have, or because of the ethnicity that we have. What are some of the class that we were born into, right? In terms of like how we see our standing in society. Like, what are some of the belief systems that we've been born into or conditioned into because of all those things, right? Because of these filters. You have to think of, Sagittarius is sort of like sometimes filtering through all the stuff that we know to be true, right? And the thing is, though, what we know to be true is just stuff that we know to be true because of the circumstance, or the stories that we've built around our circumstances, right? Or the things that we've been told. So sometimes with Sagittarius, we need to be very careful, what we believe in, or what we hold on to in terms of our stories, or our interpretation of life, or our perspectives of life, because it can sometimes keep us back. It can sometimes keep us in a place of, I am better than you because, I am this and you are not, right? Sometimes like there's a separation that can occur because of our different circumstances and our different stories that we have about stuff. So we want to pay attention to that with the South Node in Sagittarius. And, sometimes there can be a sense that people can get a little bit fanatic with Sagittarius, especially if Pluto is involved in some way. And this year we have Pluto involved in the way that Jupiter, which is the ruler of Sagittarius, is conjunct Pluto for most of the year in Capricorn. So we might see some fanatical behavior out there in the world, especially in government or in places that are connected to Capricorn. In our business dealings, we might see some intense obsessive behaviors or fearful behaviors as well, right? Because Pluto can sometimes be fearful. But what's important here is to allow ourselves to grow. The key with this placement is to focus on self-growth, to focus on learning how to expand our perspective, learning to see things from a much bigger place, not just from a mundane place of like, this is my life and this is where I'm at, but from a place of like, what's the bigger arc here, right? What are we trying to accomplish socially with each other here, right? So that's really what we need to get to. And Gemini can help us with that, right? The North Node in Gemini can help us by engaging with other people, by communicating, by just researching or learning about different things and learning to engage in an intelligent way with each other, right? In a way where it's rational. Gemini is rational. Sagittarius is not always rational, right? Sagittarius can be quite impulsive sometimes in its way, but also sometimes it's connected to just whatever we've been conditioned into will be, what it is. So it's not always rational, right? Okay, so I hope all of this makes sense. I don't want to take too long on this. Let's go to this next page. Have a fantastic journey with the moon nodes in Sagittarius, Gemini. I will also attach an article about the moon nodes in my email to you where I sent the recording. So feel free to check that out. The article will also be available on the website after May 5th. So that's available as well for all my members. And let's see, anything else I want to say? Have a fantastic Venus retrograde. And yeah, I hope everybody's doing well and everybody's thriving as much as possible. And I will see you again on the 31st. All right? Okay, much love. Bye-bye.